an understanding of how the lines of fascia work. And although I agree with that for doing body work on the table, I think that that theory kind of breaks down a little bit when we start looking at function, right? Because for instance, if we say there's the lateral line of the body and the lateral fascia coming from the peroneals to the IT bands to the abdominal muscles, the obliques up to the side of the neck, that is a lateral line if that's important, and that's great if I'm leaning over and doing a triangle pose or I'm leaning sideways. But what about as soon as I go into rotation? I'm not really loading those lines of fascia anymore. In fact, now it's going, the same body parts are now being loaded through my transverse abdominis or for my glutes. So it's great to look at fascia in static, and it helps us to understand how things go together. But in reality, if you guys have ever worked on cadavers, we could cut up a cadaver through the lines of fascia and get from any cell in the body, any body part, to any other body part through a fascial continuity. And so, you know, if we start breaking the body up into big chunks of static tissue that don't move, we're really going to miss a lot about how the anatomy actually works, because your fascial system is one big piece of helical wraps, and what becomes important and where to treat that fascia, we have to look at function. And a lot of times in just looking at structure, we look at that and not function and not energetics. And we're not trying to create, when we work on people, just these lovely mannequins that look great against a plumb line. That's not realistic. We want people that go out and move and express themselves. So yes, the structural body is very, very important, but if we don't understand why we're working on it and the other things that affect it, we're really going to get into this little box about fascial anatomy and how we can work with it. So you guys are going to understand that anatomy a lot differently when we're done today. So next, let's move on to the functional level. The functional level, we're going to be talking about the Rajasic level in Ayurvedic, or the Holy Spirit in Christianity, right? What gives us movement, how things happen, what's going on there. So if we look at the function, the movement, and the physiology, this is a very, very important level, and it's just as important as anything else. So when we think about functional concepts, we're going to break this down into really, really simple terms, right? Most of the information we talk about today I got from the Gray Institute, which I'll mention in a moment. So none of this is really my information. There's nothing new under the sun, but I want to teach you guys those concepts that you can think about the body differently and actually apply it. So when we think about movement and we think about function, we're going to think about the body loading and unloading, the eccentric and concentric contractions. So when we think about that, most people think about just concentric training. Like when we go to the gym and we do a squat, we're just going to think about putting heavy weights on and doing this concentric contraction and coming up. You know, or if I'm going to jump to the ceiling, I can't just stand there and jump. I actually have to load. So the concentric, the loading of the muscles, is just as important, if not more important, than the concentric. Because if I can't squat down in a very successful way to load my muscles in my body, I'm not going to be able to explode into a powerful concentric explosion. So the whole concept of loading and exploding, this eccentric and concentric contraction, is very important. Now, another thing we need to think about with body work is that the muscles accelerate and decelerate all the time, right? So if I'm going to do a motion, I have to bend forward. So let's say, hey, I'm going to bend forward at my waist. So I'm going to start a motion. I'm going to kind of accelerate forward. But another part of that movement is I'm going forward quickly. I need to start accelerating to a point to do the movement, but then I'm going to decelerate to slow that motion down and stop it, because otherwise I just go real fast and hit my face on my knees and break my teeth out and cause problems, or rip a joint in half or a ligament. So the brain in motion is going to think about that eccentric contraction, the decelerative emotion, which is more important. And then we could also think about that in motion, right? If you're walking, the pronation and the supination of your feet, your body has to pronate and load the foot come forward and then explode out of that and go into supination. That's how the body works. Loading, unloading, pronating, supinating. That's motion. Every body part does that. And the important thing I want you guys to think about in the concept of muscle contraction, or what people don't get or they're not taught in structural work, is they just go in and loosen up tissue. Well, why is the body tightening that up? Well, you know, in the structural dynamics, we talk about lock short and lock long tissue, which is very important to go loosen up the locked short tissue so the lock long tissue, where all the pain is, can let go and stop working. Well, then we have to ask the question, well, why is that tissue locked short? And one of the main reasons it is because the body is afraid to do a motion, or it knows it's going to get hurt. So in other words, if I'm sitting in flexion all day long like this, and my abdominals are tight and my hip flexors are tight, I'm going to stand up. And why, if I stand up, why can't I go back to neutral normal posture? Well, my brain goes, well, you've been sitting in a car and a desk and bending over patients for years, but nobody ever showed you to go into the eccentric contractions of your abdominals or your hip flexors, and you never teach them how to go through extension. And not only just extension, but through all three planes of motion. So the brain goes, you know what, I don't have the coordination or the strength to eccentrically load or decelerate the motion backwards, so I'm not even going to go there. I'm going to lock up my abdominals and my hip flexors, because if I do go into extension, I can't decelerate it. We're going to blow out the spine. So my goal as a body is to protect my central nervous system and my organs. So if I'm going to do a motion that I can't decelerate and stop, we're not going there. So we're going to lock it all up. So that shows us why our chronic tissue is restricted, because the brain knows it can't do a motion, it's going to get hurt. But inevitably, we will do that motion and then we'll get injured. So we talk about this motion, right? Every body part, every tissue, every muscle, every ligament goes through three planes of motion in 3 dimensions. So one of my mentors, one of my favorite people in the world is Dr. Gary Gray. I'm actually a gift fellow. I went through his training a couple years ago because I was actually teaching a structural dynamics class years ago, and one of my friends, one of my students, Neil Day, he was a gift fellow, and he was from the UK. And after standing up there watching me talk about structure for a couple days, I'm not going to fake his English accent because I'm really bad, but he basically said, hey mate, do you know why you have chronic thoracic pain? And I'm like, how did you figure that out? He goes, well, I've been watching you walk and lecture for 3 days. And I'm like, yeah, well, I dislocated my spine or hurt it bad in high school wrestling. That's it. He goes, no, it has nothing to do with it. So he put me in a doorway and got my thoracic spine into extension and drove it through a couple planes of motion and had me move my foot in a certain way. And I felt all these ligaments in my spine loosening up, and then it was just crazy. I went and walked, and it was the first time that I didn't have thoracic tension in my spine. And this was after having 50 Rolfing sessions, 1 million energy medicine sessions. Some of the best structural people and PTs in the world work on me. And this was the first time it loosened up. And I went, looks like I need to go back to school. So that's why I went and learned the functional movement. It was life-changing for me. Right now, that wouldn't work for everybody, but it's very important. So this guy, Gary Gray, was always a rebel in function. And what he did, and what I love about him is he's given us this term called mostability. It's the concept of stability with motion, right? Mostability. And so when I think about the concept of mostability, I think about this lovely structured person that can almost be like a tree. And so the strongest tree in the forest is going to be the most flexible one when the storm comes, right? And so if we can't have good loading and unloading and range of motion through all 3 planes of motion, right? The frontal motion, side to side, the sagittal motion, front and back, and transverse plane motion, in every single part of the body, our brain's going to lock it down. The proprioceptive nervous system won't be stimulated, and that's it. So this functional motion is very, very important, okay? So when we think about the concept of alignment then, right? Because a lot of people will say, oh, I'm out of alignment. Oh, I threw my back out. Oh, I need to get my spine aligned. Well, that's all well and good, and I get that. But problems typically with your bones are always going to be secondary to structure and function, right? So when we think about alignment, alignment isn't a solid thing. If I get my head, you know, people say, oh, you have a head forward posture. Well, the relationship of my head to my shoulders or my rib cage may be a little bit off, but it's not like I go, okay, bring it back here now with all that's good. Or you have a vertebrae and we're going to adjust it and put it in place. Well, you never throw your back out or your vertebrae don't go out, right? What they actually do is they get stuck and they stop moving and shut down function. And then your tensegrity fails and then you start getting a joint locked up. But most of that comes from poor structure or a lack of function, because what we're trying to do when we work on tissues to get bones to move better or with an adjustment is we're creating motion. So alignment is not being in place, right? Because if that was true, I'd have to sit like this, and as soon as I look to the right, oh, I'm out of alignment, I'm not healthy. Well, right, do you see how that's kind of crazy? You're never really in alignment. Alignment isn't an exact alignment thing. And so one of the quotes I really love about that next is the concept of dynamic alignment. And here we have Eric Franklin, who I really love his work. If you guys have ever taken one of our classes, you know, we use his work in all of our classes. My wife, Ann, is a Franklin Method instructor, and Damian McCann, one of my favorite people in the world, he teaches the functional movement for organs in our visceral dynamics class. They've both trained under Eric. And his quote about alignment is basically about dynamic alignment. And that means that alignment is maintained through balancing forces rather than through holding a position. So when we're moving, we're balancing these forces with gravity inside. It's not positioning boning points in space, but we're aligning centers of mass. We're creating these amazing relationships in the body that can go into a flexion and extension and go into a rotation or frontal plane motion, which is how the body moves and expresses itself. And you guys that have taken, if you haven't taken a Franklin Method class, I highly recommend it. If you guys take our classes, you will get a healthy dose of that, because I've never seen anything in the functional world that helps you to really embody and understand how your body works. So an instance in our visceral dynamics class, Damian will take you through where every organ is and how, when you breathe in your walk, what your liver does, what your lungs do. And when you leave, you will be like, oh my gosh, I actually feel my liver and where it was restricted and how it moves. It's like this whole abdomen gets filled in. So everybody loves that class, because we have a lot of people that have taken a lot of the amazing visceral release classes out there, but they go, wow, this is great, but they were static. Now I know what the liver does when it moves, and I can actually feel my liver, or I can feel my pancreas. And it's the weirdest feeling, right? We should have awareness of that all the time. And so if you come into our class too, like our structural dynamics class, and if you've never felt your facet joints move, or you've never actually felt your atlas and occiput move when you turn your head or your vertebrae, even your sacroiliac joint, if you've never felt that move, then how are you going to know when it's healthy? And if you've never felt it move in yourself and you know what it feels like to have it healthy, how can you possibly create that experience for your clients? And when I started learning function and started working with people, I'm like, all these bells went on, because I'm like, oh my gosh, how are my clients supposed to get better if I can't teach them what it's really like to have a joint move or even understand how it moves? And so Eric's really given us some really great insights into that functional aspects, as long as Gary Gray. I'm more of the Gary Gray guy. I'm going to show you what all the muscles do and how they do it, and all the misinformation of what's taught out there about function. And Ann and Damian will get you to experience all that in your body. It's fun. So now we're going to move on to the informational or energetic level. And this is where people kind of go, oh, I don't know about this energy medicine.